Hello everybody. Exo-6 finally released the first of their Star Trek 6 figures earlier last week. And for me personally, alongside Chang, this is one of the most anticipated releases of the year. So I'm not going to beat about the bush, I'm going to get straight into my review. And as ever, we kick off by taking a look at the packaging, which is pretty familiar to anyone who has any other Exo-6 figures. It's the standard oblong box, it has the standard branding, and we have this nice headshot of the figure front and center, which is kind of a glossy image, which is contrasted nicely against the matte of the black background. This is a perfectly serviceable approach. I don't think it's the most exciting image they could use for this series, but it's worked so far for them, and I think it works pretty well, and it's nice and consistent with other figures in the line. But if we take a look at that top right hand corner, what we do see here is actually the image taken from the Star Trek 6 or the Undiscovered Country's film poster, which is really quite cool. I've always loved this film poster. In fact, I love all the original movie posters. I think they're just fantastically illustrated and painted, and just think they look brilliant. So why not take full advantage of that? What I did want to point out though is that this is slightly unusual for Exo-6 because generally speaking what they do is they typically commission new artwork to represent a series or a franchise. They haven't done that here, but this works perfectly well. And then if we flip it to look at the reverse, this is always slightly disappointing to me because it's largely just a black void of empty space with a lot of small print. We do see a slightly enlarged image of the figure itself and some of his various accessories, but otherwise there's not much to write home about here or put on display particularly. We can of course slide this upper slipcase off though, and underneath we can see another box with the window display with the figure in all of his glory. Sadly there's no decos going on underneath this slipcover, it is just black borders all the way around. Okay, so let's get on with the meat of this review and take a look at the figure itself. And if we start off by taking a look at the head sculpt in terms of this likeness, I'm a little disappointed. This is not as sharp as I was expecting. In fact, I'd say it's quite far away from an accurate likeness of George Takei. And I must admit, I wasn't expecting that. Generally speaking, I think Exo-6 have been very, very on the ball with this kind of thing. Their sculpts have usually been very, very good. There's been a few degrees here and there and some better examples than others, but this one feels like one of the weakest ones in my collection, and I have to admit that really, really surprised me. The other thing that I think you'll probably be able to see from this image here is that the collar is really, really low down. Now, I've been able to fluff this up since I filmed this review, so the collar now protrudes a little bit above the shoulders, but still it's not enough. And if we look at the image from the screenshot that I've got on screen there, you will see that obviously this is quite a puffy collar. This actually extends, not just above the red of the suit, but actually, has a wider girth as well. And frankly, the collar just doesn't feel puffy enough or tall enough on this figure, so it doesn't look as if it fits in particularly well. It's almost like this costume was made for another character and the Sulu head has just been put on top, and it doesn't quite scale as nicely as it should. Now, having said that, I do think the costume itself is glorious, and I think the tailoring is really, really nicely done. So I do love how they've approached this. I suppose my criticism or my complaint might be that it just doesn't feel like it's meant for Sulu's body. It just doesn't feel right to me, to be honest. He feels too tall and a little bit too gangly, and that's not quite how I see the character. But as I say, the costume itself is glorious, and there's so many lovely little details. I've always loved this costume, so it was critical that they got it right, and I think it works really, really well here. So of course we have the strap at the top there, as we'll see in a moment, that does unbuckle. That seems to be entirely screen accurate. We have the Starfleet logo badge. There's a separate plastic piece that is glued into position, which is great. He's got the leather of the belt. He's got the insignia again, a separate piece that's also glued onto the belt there. Feels real quality, a lot of depth and texture happening here, which is fantastic. And if we flip it and look at the reverse, again, we've got all the lovely piping and trimming, which just looks really, really screen accurate. And I think, this looks fantastic in terms of the colours. This is exactly what I'd expect. It's that lovely deep maroon, and it just works really, really well. So this definitely lives up to my expectations of what I think of when I think of this costume on screen. And then if we zoom in for a closer look at some of the detailing here on that shoulder strap, likewise on the insignia, you can see there's a lot of fine paint going on here and it looks really, really screen accurate, a lot of detail, which is lovely. We can unclip that shoulder strap as well. There's a little clipper, a popper button here, as you can see, and then you can fold back just like they do in the films, although to be fair, I don't think we ever see Captain Sulu do this, but you can see you can fold back that, which is fantastic. What I was surprised by is this sort of chain effect underneath. I don't remember seeing that in the films, but I could be mistaken on that. If so, I'm guessing it's pretty accurate. Otherwise, why include it? And I think it's a really lovely detail because I love it when these action figures draw out things that I've never really particularly noticed. But of course, that also has a popper, so you can undo that so you can see the white of the polo neck shirt underneath. Then if we look a little bit closer at the badge insignia, we can see they're using two different types of paint here, which is absolutely fantastic. We can see a sort of lighter yellowy gold and then a much darker, deeper hued gold, which is brilliant, creating a real sense of depth there, which is really, really nice. And again, the detailing around the belt is really nice. It's such a simple element of the costume, but it's so effectively done. We can see the fine stitching in the leather of the belt there. We can see the hoops where it slides in comfortably. And of course, we have the insignia as a separate piece, just neatly glued into place. And it looks really, really nice and trim and perfectly fitted. And again, we can see some real fine stitching on the cuffs there, particularly where we have the ribbon going around, again, nicely painted. Really, really lovely details here and really finely fitted. There is another plastic element here, which again, nicely sculpted, well painted. This is also stuck on with glue. Now, I do have to point out, unfortunately, that this did pop off on mine pretty soon after opening him up. So I think there's maybe a small QC issue there to be aware of. I was able to fix it back on with a little bit of super glue, although it did stain the costume ever so slightly. But it's not too bad. It's very, very minor. But I did want to point that out for anyone who wants to get their figure out and pose it, that there's a risk that some of these pieces can fall off. Of course, this costume also features the flared trousers, which I've always really, really liked, the bell bottoms there, and he's got the red piping going down the centre of them. Otherwise, not too much to write home, except to say that they're a very nice quality, nice thick material here, and of course they hover over the boots just as they should. If we lift them up, we can see the elastic there. The one thing I did want to point out is that underneath it does have a tendency to stain the leg, but I'm guessing this isn't going to be too much of a problem for you if you're not planning to display him this way, and why would you? Although I did think it was surprising he doesn't have socks. I always love it when they have little details like that. Unfortunately, they haven't gone the extra mile on this occasion. So let's take a look at the articulation. He does have a ball joint at the top of the neck there, so he can rotate his head 360 degrees, no problem at all. He can even lean his neck left and right a pretty healthy distance too. He can also bend his neck forwards and backwards a really nice distance, so this is very comfortable in terms of creating some of those extra poses. As you'd expect, he also has ball joints in the shoulders and there's a butterfly wing joint there as well to aid the arms being able to be lifted up and forwards and backwards. So again, a pretty decent range of motion, hampered a little bit by the thickness of the cotton of the costume. It is nice and thick there, nice and luxurious, so it does hinder the articulation a little bit, but not drastically. Likewise, he does have a bicep swivel and a double pin at the elbow, but again, he can't quite get his hand to touch his head because of the thickness of the costume. Then, of course, he does also have the standard ball joint at the wrist. Of course, the hand will rotate all the way around and it will hinge forwards and backwards with no issues whatsoever. There's more ball joints in the torso, of course, particularly in the waist there, so he can rotate all the way around and he can lean left and right a pretty decent distance as well, which is really nice and pretty comfortable. He can also bend forwards and backwards a little bit. It's not a huge range, again, some hindrance from the costume itself, but certainly when it comes to bending backwards, it is quite a decent range of motion here. Now, there are ball joints in the hips. The leg can kick out to the side to a degree. Obviously, you don't want to stretch it too far and pop any stitches. There's also a thigh swivel up there as well. The leg will kick forwards a little bit. Well, a pretty healthy distance. Again, you want to be very mindful of the material that you're dealing with here. But the leg will also come back a little bit. And there is, of course, a double pin at the knee. So that lower leg will kick all the way back there, which is lovely. And then finally, we have a straight swivel at the ankle, allowing the foot to move all the way around. And we also have a little bit of a hinge in there as well, letting it move forward and backwards a small degree with a slight pivot as well. In terms of accessories, Captain Sulu is relatively light, although, to be fair, he doesn't have a huge amount of screen time in Star Trek 6. So I think what we get here is pretty healthy, and he does come with an additional 4 hands, 2 closed fists, 2 gripping hands, his Starfleet phaser, which is very cool, obviously bespoke to Star Trek 6, and his mug of tea as well from the Excelsior, which is really lovely and probably the nicest prop and the most distinct prop that we get with this figure. And of course, we get a Starfleet transporter display stand, and I wanted to note this one because they've finally shaken it up and done something a little bit different, or at least I should say this is the first time I think I've seen this particular display stand in this series of figures that I own in my collection. A little bit different to what we usually get. Typically, they tend to always be the same, but I'm really pleased with what we're seeing here. We actually have this elevated plastic element in the center of the display stand here, which is really, really nice. It gives the surface area a little bit less for the figure to actually stand on, which makes it a little bit awkward, but it's not really too much of a problem. And I do really appreciate that we're doing something slightly different now, which is really, really cool. And it varies the stands up because they were feeling a little bit too generic for me. So I'm glad that we've got something a bit more distinct and a bit more bespoke for Captain Sulu. Of all the accessories, the closed fist is probably the weakest in my opinion because it just doesn't feel right with this figure, particularly not with this expression. I'm not quite sure why we got these since, Captain Sulu doesn't really get into any fisticuffs, at least not on screen. So this felt a little bit redundant. I probably won't be displaying this figure with the closed fist option. The phaser is absolutely lovely. Of course, this is the first time we're seeing the Star Trek 6 phaser. Obviously, very different, very distinct to any other phasers in any of the other shows or movies. I happen to really love this design, a significant improvement, evolution of the Type 2 phaser. I think it looks great, actually. And a lot of detailing here. It's very, very nicely sculpted and really nicely painted, too. And I'm pleased to say it fits his gripping hand like a glove, as you would hope, as almost as if it was made, sculpted to fit it, which of course it was. It looks absolutely fantastic. Nice solid grip here, and it looks really, really cool in his hand, I have to say. This is probably one of the key ways I'll be displaying this figure, even though, again, we don't see a huge amount of action from Captain Sulu in the film. I do think this just looks really, really cool, and I'm really excited to get some of the other figures from this particular movie. And then we have the cup and saucer, a really lovely touch, obviously a very significant prop from the film. It does get a particular bit of focus, and I really like that they've replicated that here. It feels entirely appropriate, and it's really fun. And as I said, it's that one of those elements that's really distinct to Captain Sulu, I think. Of course, he holds it really well. I'm really pleased that this actually just fits around his finger really snugly there, and it looks really very, very cool. So, of course, you can put it on the saucer, you can have it off. We do actually see there's tea inside the mug as well, so you can make it look like he's about to have a sip as well. I think this is really fun, and again, for me, this is probably how I'm going to display the figure going forwards. Okay, so in summary then, final thoughts from me. A bit of a mixed bag, this release, to be honest. There was a lot of expectation around it from myself, I acknowledge that, so perhaps that skewed my opinion somewhat, but it just doesn't feel quite right to me, this release. Now, I love the accessories. I actually love the tailoring on the costume itself. I think it looks glorious. It's really, really nicely produced figure. I like that we get a brand new display stand as well, or at least it's the first time for me. I think this looks really, really good. Some new props here, some new sculpts, really very fun details indeed. However, some of the things that really let this figure down for me is definitely that head sculpt. This is very, very disappointing. That I was not anticipating at all. I thought this would be really sharp. So that threw me immediately. And I think the other element is that this doesn't feel quite right. The scaling feels slightly off somehow. And it's almost as if this head has been placed on the wrong body. This feels more like a Spock or a Kirk body, and Sulu's head isn't quite in proportion to that, obviously being a slightly smaller frame. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. It just feels ever so slightly off kilter. Now that may well change when we get the other figures in the series and I put them next to him. Maybe we'll then have a bit more insight into what's going on, and maybe it'll look more appropriate. But as it stands right now, it just doesn't look quite right, and part of that I suppose is the collar, but also as I say, that likeness is just really disappointing. And then the final thing for me that kind of disappointed me was the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, there was elements of the costume that did fall off, particularly on his arm. Now hopefully you won't experience that, but nevertheless that felt like a disappointing quality control issue, which I'm very surprised by because I've never ever experienced that with Exo-6 before. Hopefully it's just a freak occurrence. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do consider giving the video a like. That kind of thing really does help the channel out and it allows me to keep making more content. And if you're interested in seeing more content, remember to hit subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos coming soon.